as the webinar gets underway. So thank you all very much for making the time to join us today. We're delighted that we're having this webinar, that we're officially launching our monitoring guidance for cash transfer programming in emergencies. You may well have seen the guidance already. It was being developed by CALP with a team of consultants based on a need that was very clearly identified by the community of practice for specialized guidance for monitoring cash transfer programs. The guidance has been developed by a small team who you're going to hear from today, who we'll all hear from today, with some essential inputs from an advisory group drawn from across the community of practice. And we'll be able to talk a little bit more about the process we followed as well as the contents, if that's of interest. We're grateful to everyone who's been involved, and as I mentioned, grateful to you for making the time to join us today. And we also must particularly thank USAID, whose support has made this work possible. So what we're planning to do today is take about half an hour to for three speakers to go through the guidance, and that will be Sophie Martin-Simpson, Flora Grudenhuis, and Ruth McCormack. You may well know Sophie and Flora and Ruth. Here are some details of their background online. As we go, please feel free to enter any comments or questions you might have in the chat box on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. And then after the presentations, we'll have a question and answer session for about half an hour, and we'll try and go through those questions and would welcome any further questions you might have. We'll try to complete the webinar within the hour. We'll see how we go. If there's appetite to continue the conversation, we can extend by a little bit. Just a note to mention, the webinar will be recorded, and that recording will be available, so this will be on public record. And could I ask you please to mute your microphone when you're not speaking. So that's all from me, and I'm delighted to pass over to Sophie and ask her to start the presentation of the guidance.
Many thanks, Alex. Hi, everybody. I'm Sophie. Thanks for joining us today. So following on from Alex said, the aim of this webinar is to provide you all with an overview of the monitoring for CTP guidance in order that you can understand the purpose and the intended audience. So a bit more about why the guidance was developed in the first place, how it was developed, the structure of the guidance and an overview of its content, so a bit more about the what and the how, and finally to explain a bit about the plan for testing the guidance. So kicking off with why this guidance was developed in the first place, and as Alex said, it was recognised by the community of practice that there's an abundance of existing requirements, guidelines, tools and toolkits for CTP that have been developed both by agencies that implement CTP directly and also by donors. But this has led to some confusion about what the priority CTP-specific monitoring issues are, how and when to collect CTP-specific data, and also how to analyse it and how to use this data meaningfully. So it was envisaged that this guidance would not aim to develop new tools and methodologies, but to provide a map to assist practitioners in navigating existing resources. So we've done this through collating and curating existing documentation and highlighting the most important CTP-specific monitoring requirements in humanitarian contexts, with the purpose that this would support field practitioners to be able to pick up the guidance and say, okay, I understand that these are the most important CTP monitoring things we need to think about. How can I then put them into my bigger project or program MEAL framework, or even organisational level MEAL framework? And the idea is that this guidance is very much a central living resource. So it promotes a common understanding of the most important CTP monitoring issues. And it's living in that it's in a format where tools and resources can be updated on an ongoing basis. So at the moment, the guidance is complemented by a repository of resources on specific topics. And as policy and practice evolves, these can be updated periodically. The guidance is also designed to support project teams and organisations in their achievement of, first and foremost, quality CTP for and with beneficiaries. Secondly, the 2016 Grand Bargain, which outlines a shared commitment to better serve people in need and includes a commitment to increasing the use and coordination of cash-based programming and also increasing transparency and the inclusion of people receiving aid. We also hope it will support organisations to realise the core humanitarian standard on quality and accountability and the sphere standards. The primary audience for this guidance is very much field level practitioners. So here we're talking about CTP specialists, sector technical specialists and meal specialists, but also managers who are in charge of implementing projects or programs with CTP components. The secondary intended audience are humanitarian stakeholders, maybe working at regional or global level, who are involved in advancing CTP policy and practice. So how was the guidance developed? Well, as Alex mentioned, it was a team of 3 consultants, so myself, Flor and Stuart Jordan, who's an ICT specialist. It's a 6-month process and it involved a scoping phase, a development phase and then a review phase. It was project managed by CALP and as Alex said, was overseen and guided by an advisory group that consisted of 12 CALP members. And in addition to these advisory group members, the draft guidance was also reviewed by 6 different institutional donors. So there's been a lot of different viewpoints, a lot of different voices have inputted into what this guidance contains today. What was lacking, or what's lacking to date, has been an in-depth review by field-level practitioners. So we've talked to field-level practitioners through key informant interviews to help inform what's in the guidance, but we have had a limited number of field practitioners actually reviewing them to date. So what does the guidance actually look like? How is it structured? Well, this slide here shows you the logic that underpins the guidance, and it's logic that's typically found in a log frame and is made up of process and activities, outputs and outcomes. And you'll notice here that we've left off goal or impact level objectives because they're typically the domain of evaluation, and we've also left off inputs that are the precursor to process and activities because they're the domain of project design, and this guidance focuses on monitoring. But if I run you through the logic here, so the process and activities are where people who are eligible to receive cash transfers are registered and verified. Then the process of actually transferring the cash or vouchers via the chosen delivery mechanism, with the output being that the beneficiary is in possession of the cash or vouchers. The immediate outcome is that beneficiary households can then spend the cash or vouchers, with the medium-term outcome being changes in beneficiary households' ability to meet basic needs or sector-specific outcomes, or to reduce use of negative coping strategies. So in that, the monitoring is split out into process monitoring and outcome monitoring, running through, or common to both, are then risk and context, gender and equity monitoring, and also considerations for accountability to affected populations. And here's an overview of the different parts of the guidance. It's split out into 6 different parts. So parts 1 and 2 covering monitoring fundamentals and skills and capacities. Parts 3 and 4 looking at process and outcome monitoring. Part 5 considers considerations that are specific to multi-purpose grants, and they've been separated out on purpose. Obviously, they relate to process and outcome, but it was thought good to have them in their own section. Part 6 looks at some guidance for analysing and using CTP data, and then there are some specific supporting materials that you can see on the right of this slide that cover specific topics, which I'll talk through a bit later. Also want to draw your attention to symbols that are used throughout the guidance, and they're listed here. And we thought this is important because we wanted to highlight specific levels of monitoring or monitoring issues that we were talking about throughout the guidance. So for example, where issues relate to market level monitoring or monitoring at the level of beneficiary or household, and whether they're monitoring issues relating to risk, context, equity, protection or gender. Also issues related to accountability to affected populations. On top of that, we wanted to highlight where issues we were talking about actually influence the cost of a project and hence project efficiency, and also the speed and timeliness of a project, and finally issues that affect project effectiveness. So you'll see these symbols pop up throughout the guidance. I think it's quite important to highlight here what the guidance isn't. And it is definitely not a step-by-step instruction manual on how to do monitoring for CTP. And it assumes that the reader has an existing knowledge of the humanitarian project or program cycle, the fundamentals of M&E good practice in humanitarian context, accountability to affected populations, and basic assessment and analysis skills. And where the reader feels they don't have this grounding, we pointed them in the direction of resources where they can get this information. The guidance also doesn't and cannot replace the need for project teams to apply critical thinking to the context in which they're working. And that's because there's no one-size-fits-all approach to monitoring CTP. Contextualization of the approaches and tools outlined in the guidance are absolutely essential. And the other thing that this guidance can't do is solve or cure existing systemic problems with M&E across the humanitarian sector. So, for example, it can't solve the issues of under-prioritization for M&E, or lack of resources, including skilled people, money, or time. That said, we can talk a bit more about what the guidance does cover and what's in it. So the first two sections, or parts 1 and 2, cover monitoring fundamentals and skills and capacities. And what's interesting about these sections is that it's generally good practice that is applicable for any monitoring approach and subject. But we have used CTP-specific examples to make it relevant. What we're hoping is that after the testing phase of the guidance, we might be able to update and pull out some real CTP-specific meal skills and capacities and add them back into the guidance. But time will tell on that one. Part 3 looks at process monitoring, and it's structured in the way that this slide shows. So we've pulled out key process and output monitoring issues and also indicator categories. And these were collated and curated from 22 different guidelines, toolkits and frameworks promoted by both implementing agencies and donors. And as you can see there, we've highlighted the symbols for which issues these monitoring issues and indicator categories relate to. We then go on to talk about data collection methodologies and tools, in particular post-distribution monitoring, on-site monitoring, and some of the considerations you might want to think about if you want to try and measure the speed, cost, and efficiency of CTP. And these are all underpinned by technology considerations that can help you if you want to use technology for your process monitoring or to support your process monitoring. So a bit more about post-distribution monitoring. It outlines good practice guidance regarding the objectives of PDM, its potential content, tools you can use, and also recommendations around the frequency of doing post-distribution monitoring. Efficiency relates to how well inputs are converted to outputs, and therefore very much related to process monitoring. And efficiency can encompass measurements of both cost and speed in achieving project outputs. And in this guidance, we focused a bit on the cost aspect, and we've outlined 2 approaches to measuring cost efficiency. The first one is about estimating how much it costs in administrative and project management per dollar transferred to beneficiaries. And the second is identifying factors that influence the efficiency of the operation. So within that, we provide an overview of 4 ways that cost efficiency can be expressed, and these are the 4 listed in the second box in this table here. So that's percentage of total budget represented by the transfer, the alpha ratio, the total cost to transfer ratio, and finally the admin cost per household per month. And I'm not going to say more about them now, but just to say that we've provided links in the guidance to specific resources that take you through the methodologies if you want to try and measure these things. Part 4 focuses on outcome monitoring. It has a similar structure to the process monitoring part, but here the data collection methods and tools we focus on are income, expenditure and utilization data, market monitoring, and considerations if you want to try and measure the cost effectiveness of CTP. Again, underpinned by things you might want to think about if you want to use technology to support your outcome monitoring. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Flor, who's going to talk you through the rest of this section.
Hello, everyone. This is Flor, and thank you, Sophie. So moving on with part 4, which is focused on income, expenditure, and utilization, as Sophie introduced. what's really important here is understanding the relationship between income and expenditure, and not just gathering data without looking at how income affects expenditure and vice versa, and how do households' income change during a project, during a cash transfer project, as well as their expenditure patterns, and to consider, what are one-time seasonal costs in that specific context that households are going to be dealing with within that specific area, and then looking at what you also need to consider in that case is whether you want to monitor specifically the costs of the transfer versus actually the overall expenditure. And we've actually recommended that you really do want to look at the overall expenditure and income, but this may not always be possible depending on the duration of your cash program and of the context. So we want to recognize that this is a very complex part of gathering essential data, but what is really important is to understand how the cash transfer does change both income and expenditure, because they're not separate, they're all interrelated with each other. And then specifically looking at a multi-purpose grant, which is defined as a grant that is based on covering people's basic needs as they have defined them, and looking at what part of the minimum expenditure basket, which is defined by households, and is context specific. It's not a standard that is all over, and also includes the humanitarian priorities. And then within wanting to understand within the MPG, and we'll come back to that in the following slides, is really looking at how that part that the cash transfer is going to support in meeting people's basic needs actually does that, and how it changes their purchasing power. So another way, instead of to really get into all the quantitative analysis of income and expenditure and the right sample sizes and all of that, is to actually focus a bit more on a lighter touch by using potential qualitative questions. And these are very basic questions as to why households have chosen to spend their cash transfer in the way that they have, and understanding what motivates their choices. And this probably will not be the same for each household, and how have households used these goods and services that they have purchased through the cash transfer, and what difference have these transfers made, and when have they used the transfer, so what time of year, and for what sort of specific needs. And then what's important to consider is the frequency of collection. It's not about just constantly collecting monitoring data for the sake of it, but really looking at what the collection rate should be depending on how long the project is, the time frame of the intervention, and what your data needs are. Also part of Part 4 is market monitoring, which is an essential component of cash transfer programming. We really want to understand what's happening at the market, how the cash transfer is affecting the ability of the market to absorb this input of cash into the economy, but at the same time to understand if it's having an effect on prices. So CALP has developed a very useful resource called the market monitoring, the MISMA resource. And basically, we refer to that in the guidance. But the point of market monitoring is really to determine if the value and assistance is still adequate, to track quality and availability of goods and services for the project duration, to ensure there is no harm to local markets, and to test the appropriateness of your cash transfer program delivery, as well as to assess the wider multiply effect on the local economy. And then lastly, as you know, a lot of this monitoring is what is also used in project evaluation. This market data is important for that as well at the end stage, or in a midterm evaluation, depending on how long the project is. But that's something that's separate and not covered in a guidance, the evaluation part. And as part of outcome monitoring, we go through, or the guidance goes through cost effectiveness and cost effectiveness analysis. and looks at the relative cost of achieving a desired outcome, which is cost effectiveness. And the analysis actually calculates what the cost per outcome is of that project or that specific program. And there are various approaches to that. And typically this is more part of evaluation rather than monitoring. And you know, as Sophie pointed out earlier, you know, we don't go into this in a lot of detail, but there's all sorts of resources that you can access to understand specifically what the different approaches are and how to use them to yours. But the summary of this is that there is no gold standard to cost effectiveness and cost effective analysis. And it's about using common sense to what is important for your specific project. Then the next part, part 5, is a section specifically on multi-purpose grants and what to sort of consider. And it sort of goes through what is the definition of a multi-purpose grant and looking at what sort of indicators would you select for an MPG project. And then the chapter continues to looking at outcome monitoring for projects using MPG, and that essentially dividing it into 2 parts, that you really want to understand how people meet their basic needs, and then how people cope. And we go into sort of different measurements of coping strategies and well-being and people's ability to meet, households' ability to meet basic needs. So as a sort of an overall indicator that we could look at for multi-purpose grants is the percentage of households that are able to meet their basic needs. And basic needs comprises of a lot of different things, but we look at sort of a composite, a potentially way to develop a composite indicator that may require collation of data from multiple sector-specific outputs or immediate outcome indicators. And that sort of how households, the percentage of households' ability to access the basic needs can be added up by the percentage of households accessing sufficient and safe water for domestic use, the percentage of households with access to basic, safe and dignified shelter solutions, percentage of households able to meet their basic food needs, and that these are the indicators that are the components that make up the overall basic needs. And this is not a sort of a definition that is static. You know, I think it really is context specific as to what your aim of your multi-purpose grant is. But in general, multi-purpose grants are aimed to meet a gap in basic needs as defined by people in that specific context. And then unpacking a little bit sort of the coping strategies and indexes and scales that have been used for that. And looking at coping strategies, what really is essential is to understand people's capabilities to cope and people's flexibilities, and when do those coping strategies become negative coping strategies, and how long are households able to, is that sort of something that is acceptable, and how can an MPG really support that? And they can't be really attributed to one sector. I mean, the way our lives works is that we don't divide our lives into different sectoral outcomes. You know, we look at how we manage and how we're able to support, you know, ourselves as a family. So it's sort of an arbitrary way to try and divide everything per sector. And so in each context, you really need to look at how people weigh up the priorities and the decision-making across a range of their own self-identified needs. And there have been indices and scales that are developed for looking at resilience and well-being, but they're very complicated measurements and they need to be adjusted to context. And we've included these links. So FAO has been developing a resilience index that goes through all different parts. And then there's also a World Bank has been developing a well-being score. And then there's, I think many of you will be familiar with the Coping Strategies Index, which is specifically related to how households cope in relationship to access to food, which is not the only basic need. So it's not sufficient to cover all the coping strategies. And it's sort of a big call for the, you know, the the field practitioners and people that are experimenting with how to monitor this is to look at what are simple and common sense methodologies that we can share with each other to understand better how people are coping specifically related to basic needs, and that what's really required in this is a very participatory field, context-focused approach. And now I hand back to Sophie. Thank you.
Thanks, Flor. So part 6 of the guidance looks at some good practice around analysing and using CTP data. So in the analysis, looking at how, or some advice on how to scrutinise, compare and pull out trends from your different CTP-specific data sets, and how to use that data to report against project indicators. Also includes some guidance on how to validate your analysed data and to close the feedback loop. So actually verifying the data that you've analysed with the people that you collect it from, or a representative group of people you collected the data from. And finally, some guidance on how to use your analysed data in a timely manner to inform evidence-based decision-making at different levels, but particularly about the rest of the project and remainder of project implementation. And then finally, the supporting materials that you'll find in the appendices. The first one, so each part of the guidance has its own key resource table, which provides links and a brief overview of resources on particular subjects that you can find out more information on. The second resource talks about different monitoring models. So, for example, it covers if you're implementing cash directly, or if you're working in a consortium to deliver cash, if you're working through partners, and also situations where you might be implementing and monitoring remotely. The third resource focuses on accountability to affected populations, and it tries to pull out what's specific about accountability for CTP. So, for example, you need to think beyond the donor, implementing agency, beneficiary or affected population scale, but you also need to include financial service providers and market actors. So what does accountability look like when those two different stakeholders are involved? And the fourth supporting material gives some guidance on how to select CTP data collection methods and tools. And finally, the fifth resource is a review of how to use technology to support implementation, monitoring and accountability for CTP. And it's an in-depth review of some of the most common technology platforms that are currently used to support the delivery of CTP. And with that, I'll hand over to Ruth, who's going to talk to you about the plan for testing the guidance.
Thanks very much, Sophie. Hi, everyone. So, as Sophie mentioned earlier in the intro, one of the things that was really noted as a gap when we were developing this was the fact that we weren't able to get the type of substantial input from field practitioners that we realised was really going to be necessary. And that really, ultimately we needed to develop something to start with, a kind of version 1.0 that could be tested in practice to ensure that a final version would be fit for purpose and achieving the objectives that we had at the outset. So to that end, during the development process, we realised early on that we needed to build in a kind of coordinated testing phase, which we would like to do over the next 8 to 12 months now. So looking at having an updated version in approximately sort of July 2018. And one of the other kind of rationales for that also was it really needs to look at how this guidance can be best integrated into agencies' own monitoring frameworks and processes, because it was never intended as at the start, like a standalone. It's drawing on what already exists. So, briefly, we'll be looking to collect obviously key types of feedback from those that are using it. Really looking at what is useful, what isn't useful. Are there any really key gaps in the guidance provided that need to be addressed? One of the key things as well will be kind of which of the indicators are the most useful, and perhaps kind of pointed towards a prioritization, because this was another thing at the outset that we were hoping perhaps that we could really kind of get to a point of saying, these should be your essential indicators, cash transfer programming. But again, there's such a broad range that have been used, and without being able to, again, test it in practice, it wasn't feasible to do that. So that's something else that we want to build into this kind of testing phase as a key area. So we were thinking about how to do this, and really kind of came up with two overall approaches. I'll start actually with the kind of unsupported testing. I mean, this would be where agencies actually kind of take the guidance and they provide feedback independently. And we're going to set up through the website where you can download the guidance itself, a feedback template that can be used. And obviously you could be in touch with CALP during that process. The other approach that we've got with this is something more substantial around kind of partnerships and facilitation. And so far we've got kind of two key activities that are kind of already funded and planned in the pipeline. One of these is the development of monitoring tools for MPGs. That's being led by our friends at Danish Refugee Council as part of the ERC consortium looking at operationalising MPGs. So as part of that process, they're going to be looking at how to integrate the guidance. We've also got some funding through our West Africa programme to facilitate some of the kind of the testing of the materials. So for people kind of on the line now as well, I mean, we're kind of actively looking for partner organisations there. Potentially would want to get involved and say partner with us on that. Yeah, we're really kind of open on this and flexible. You may have examples within your organisation of projects that are ongoing where you think there's opportunities to integrate some testing of this guidance, and we'd be really happy to kind of hear about what you might be able to work with us on that, discuss the options. So, I mean, yeah, it's a key question, and we don't need to respond now, but to think about, could your organisation be involved in testing the guidance, kind of which kind of countries and contexts? Obviously, we're looking for as much diversity as possible in terms of types of contexts and type of programming equally. Obviously, we want to be covering multi-purpose, but equally kind of sector-specific programming and kind of perhaps multi-modality programming as well. And you can also be thinking obviously at what stage in the programming. It might be a program that's starting out now. It might be something that's already ongoing, but there may be options to pull in some elements. But we're really open on that and be kind of open to ideas. So if you want to get in touch, please do. So take a note of my email address there and drop me a line. Brings us to the end of our main presentation. At this point, we wanted to welcome you to obviously ask us any key questions that you might have at this point. You can enter questions into the chat box, or if you've got your microphone activated, you can also ask us a question. If you do want to ask a question through the mic, if you can use the little hands up icon, which you'll see in the top right bar, and that will let us know who will speak next. So I'm going to check if we have any questions come in here. Nothing specific. Thanks, yeah, so some interest in taking part in the testing. Any questions in terms of the kind of the application, plans for piloting, or anything just about the content that you would want to address? So I can see a few people typing in the chat box, so just give it a couple of minutes, see what comes up. Okay. questions on link to key resources. So I can make a start on that, and Sophie, you might want to jump in. Yeah, so what we've done at the moment, obviously there's links throughout the document where those resources are publicly available. For the resources that are not publicly available, but that have been provided from agencies, there's actually a link to a file on the same page in the resource library where you can access the guidance itself.
Yeah, so just following up on what Ruth said, the resources that aren't available online, we have permission from the agencies that wrote them to share them. And as Ruth said, you can access them in a separate folder that's included on the same page as the
Question here from Lloyd on any particular aspects of evaluations that can be considered. I address that to you, Sophie.
Yeah, sure. So thanks for your question, Lloyd. This guidance very much focuses on monitoring. So no, we don't look at evaluation in any detail, but what we do look at, so for example, efficiency and effectiveness and cost efficiency and cost effectiveness are typical evaluation domains. So what we've tried to do is to say, if you want to measure those as part of evaluation, or you think you might want to, here are some preparatory steps you can take in terms of monitoring data you can collect to help with the measurements of efficiency and effectiveness, etc., at the point of evaluation. So that's how we've structured it.
Just as Flor here, I just wanted to add a bit about the resources and how to access them, but more importantly to say that, you know, there might be resources that are out there that we have not come across, and that's the whole point, that this guidance is a sort of live document. So if there are resources that you have found useful, please share them so that they can be included in the repository and be linked in the relevant sections, because it's really about pulling together the work that already has been done or is being done, and constantly updating that. So I just wanted to put that out there to all of you, and that's how, you know, testing it and looking through it and just giving some of those resources back to CALP and making sure that they're included is really useful.
Thanks, Paul. That's a really good idea. And just want to check if we have any further questions from the participants. See a couple of people typing again. We'll just wait to see what comes through. There may be one or two further questions coming. I think at this point, if we don't have, oh no, hang on, is there a question here? Okay, so Guled, how can we monitor CTP, ensure that it's well integrated with other projects implemented in the same geographic area with the same beneficiaries? Okay, I don't know, Sophie or Flora, do you want to have a go at that?
Sure, I'll have a go at that, and then Sophie can add on. I think it's essential with all of this that you are coordinating with other projects ongoing in the same areas and with the same beneficiaries. And I'm not sure if you mean within your own organization or through other organizations. And I think it's really not necessary to gather the same data and the same information from the same beneficiaries separately, because you're running a CTP program versus you're running somebody else is running a shelter program, and some of the information is the same. So it's really important to coordinate about who is monitoring what and how that information can be shared and used between different projects or agencies. And I think many of us know that there's a lot of data gathered from households, and that is double data, and it's really not necessary and not all right to do that doubly. So that really requires good coordination at field level between actors. Is there anything else you want to add to that, Sophie?
No, I think that absolutely covers it.
Following question here asking about how accountability to affected populations be integrated into monitoring systems.
Yeah, I can take that one. So, yeah, Lloyd, you're right. And what we promote in the guidance is that complaints and feedback mechanisms are a key source of monitoring data. So we talk about that in the main body of the guidance so that people don't forget, and also in the supporting material that focuses on accountability to affected populations. What we do need to stress or think about is that cash is usually just one component or one mechanism to help achieve particular outcomes and objectives of a project. So it's unlikely that you're going to have a cash-specific complaints and feedback mechanism. So again, it comes back to coordination and processes that are not cash-specific, but a sort of generic good practice for meal about how your CFM is managed, how complaints are logged and resolved, and how they're categorized, to make sure that in that facility and in that process, cash-specific complaints can be filtered out and passed on to the most relevant people and can be included as part of monitoring.
Thanks very much. And final question here, possibly final question, that why the outcome indicators from the MPG toolkit aren't captured in the guidance. And I don't know, Sophie, Flora, one of you probably the best place to answer.
Yep, I can start that, and then Flora can chip in if she wants to. So they very much should be, because that was one of the toolkits that was included in the review. Some of them have been consolidated, and some have been edited down. So in the process of our research, there was quite a lot of debate about actually the usefulness of the income expenditure ratio. And we talk about that in the guidance, but the indicators definitely should be reflected.
Yes, so I agree with Sophie, and if not, then it's an oversight on our part, and that's why it's a live document, and that's why we need all of your contributions of useful things to include and not forget.
So I think we probably have answered all the questions that are going to be posed. But if anyone does have obviously any further questions, contributions to this, then as I said, do please contact me on the email address that was provided before. It's programs@cashlearning.org. I think otherwise it just remains to thank well, Sophie and Flor for all of the work that they've done on bringing this guidance together to start with, and for the presentations today, and obviously to everyone that has taken the time to join us. And say, I hope that there'll be the opportunity to really continue working on this together, because say for us this is well, not the first step in the process, but we're not at the end yet. Okay, thanks very much to everyone.
Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you everyone, and thank you Ruth, and thank you Kalp.